Hello everyone and welcome to Profane Egyptologists, the show where we discuss Egypt's past in the present. Today I'm joined by my friend, the award-winning filmmaker Chris Kemble, as we discuss 2017's remake of the Universal film The Mummy. This is part one of a two-part episode where we'll dig into both the Egyptology and film history that this movie taps into. As a specialist in the horror genre, Chris is uniquely positioned to give insight into this film. And as a non-Egyptologist, he asks many questions I might not consider. I hope you enjoy this format. Feel free to send me feedback on Twitter, and please, if you like the show, subscribe on iTunes and rate and review, as that really helps us spread the word and raise the show's profile. Now, buckle up for our Halloween specials as we explore the world of The Mummy. Today we are talking about The Mummy, and that's not the beloved franchise that you may have grown up with, but rather the 2017 remake. I'm discussing this today with a filmmaker and good friend of mine, Chris Kemble. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Thank you for coming on here with us today.
Not at all.
And do you want to just, for the audience, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name's Chris. I am a filmmaker, primarily horror films so far, which I guess would give me a bit of perspective into this terribly scary film, although not necessarily for the right reasons.
It's scary for the wrong reasons. I think we're both agreed on that one. Yeah, that does leave you perfectly positioned to be the filmmaker I would want to talk to about this. And and my understanding from like conversations that we've had previously is that you've got a bit of an interest in the Mummy series itself as well. Yeah, well,
I mean, going back way back to the original Boris Karloff, my dad's always been a horror fan himself. So kind of Hammer films, the Universal films, Frankenstein is a big favourite of his, and particularly Boris Karloff. So I've always had an interest in kind of those horror films from that. And then obviously grew up, Brendan Fraser's Mummy. They were along like the lines of Indiana Jones, just adventurous but entertaining. And so I was quite excited for this new one, essentially along those lines, the kind of, well, we'll get into it.
yeah. Let's get into that. So yeah, I mean, I hear you on the Brendan Fraser 1999 Stephen Sommers, Rachel Weisz, Imhotep centric Mummy movies. That franchise, I think, came along at a really good time for me because I had developed the interest in archaeology quite young, but it had really started to zone in and focus on Egypt in the 90s, in the mid-90s specifically. And that movie kind of came along at the perfect time. There was almost what you'd call a perfect storm of Egyptomania coming in from different places. So we had, on the one side, we had the alternative archaeologists. So your Graham Hancocks, your Robert Bivals, your Andrew Collins, doing all these conferences, making a lot of noise, putting a lot of books out there about things that were going to be revealed at the Kizer Plateau on the millennium. There was this huge hype and buzz and like all this kind of crazy pop culture Egyptomania focus on the Kizer Plateau, and these alternative archaeologists were like setting up conferences and selling hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions of books. And into this storm of what we call pre-millennial Egyptomania come two things specifically. We've got the Stephen Sommers Mummy movie of 1999, and we've got, for me at least, this was a landmark as well, Tomb Raider Revelation, completely set in ancient Egypt, starring Her Royal Highness herself, Lara Croft.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of the year of Egypt, so to speak. It really was. Like there was a huge amount of material out there for anyone who was into that stuff. Now, fast forward 18 years to 2017.
Wait, was the 2000 reveal worth it?
Oh, at the Kizer Plateau.
Yeah. Was it worth the hype?
Okay, so very long story short, there was a psychic called Edgar Cayce. I think that's how you pronounce his name. By the way, FYI, I have free reign to absolutely murder all and any pronunciations on this show. That's just what I do. That's how I roll. I read things. I don't listen to things. I don't watch TV. I don't know how things are said. I just read them on books and make a best guess. So Edgar Cayce, founder of the Cayce Foundation, he predicts that something called the Hall of Records would be found under the paw of the Sphinx on the Giza Plateau at the turn of the millennium, right?
Based on psychic intuition.
Yeah. This is based on him having quote-unquote visions, which is kind of appropriate, actually, to what we're talking about today, because visions do play a big part in this movie, for better or worse.
They do indeed, yeah.
Worse. So Edgar Cayce has this prediction, and in a way that probably contributes a fair amount to the hype that starts to surround the Giza Plateau, and the reason that at least some of these alternative archaeologists jump on this in the first place is because of this prediction, and they start looking for corroborative evidence to support the notion of, one, a Hall of Records, and two, its position underneath the Giza Plateau. Now, the Giza Plateau is a huge natural granite foundation rock. It's fair to say that you could cut into it if you wanted to. It seems like there are some chambers, be they natural or man-made, underneath the Sphinx. There's nothing conclusive has come out of any of the investigations with respect to them as to whether they were, intentional or not, or have anything in them. I think a little bit of investigative work was done. It didn't really reveal much, and the SCA, that's the Supreme Council of Antiquities, at the time led by Zahi Hawass, said, this is all moot. There's really nothing to see here. Move along. That, of course, was taken as signs of a conspiracy by certain alternative archaeologists, and so the cycle goes and goes and goes. The question was the revelation worth it? And I would say it wasn't. Nothing of lasting interest to the mainstream was found. And even though every so often we get one of these kind of quote-unquote chambers pop up, there's the most recent one in the Pyramid Chamber. Mm-hmm. There's nothing really to suggest that any of the more fringe or left field theories out there have been vindicated by any of this. There are maybe a few more holes out there than we thought, but we don't really know what's in them yet. And until that happens, there's a question mark.
Which is what makes it interesting and exciting, I guess.
Of course.
To kind of, it's not definitively not there, so there's always the possibility, and that's you're striving for knowledge, right? Constantly.
Totally. And I can see the appeal. Absolutely. I mean, when it comes to something like the Hall of Records, I think that's a fascinating idea, a repository of knowledge of the ancient Egyptians themselves. Now,
would that be separate to the Library of Alexandria?
Yeah, it would be separate to the Library of Alexandria. So the Library of Alexandria was set up by the Macedonian dynasties. It was set up by Ptolemy I, actually. And it was a Greek invention. It was set up with a museum, one of the, probably the first museum, really. The word museum comes from, the Greek, the Muses museum. It's where the Muses gather and where scholars would gather to appreciate these works of art and literature, etc., etc. So a Hall of Records, in theory, is something that is referred to also in Greek works, actually, and it's this notion that the Egyptians themselves, many millennia before the Greeks came along and made the library, there's this notion that the Egyptians themselves had this repository of sacred knowledge. Now, what this knowledge is or isn't has varied over time. Some called it the 42 books of philosophy. And I should make this clear, a lot of the idea of what the Egyptians were and what they were capable of comes from a lot of misreadings from Greek and later writers. It doesn't come from the Egyptians themselves.
Interesting.
So the idea of the Hall of Records is really a postulation by later peoples saying that the Egyptians must have had this thing. There are some allusions in Egyptian mythology and Egyptian literature to things like the Book of Thoth.
Yeah.
The Book of Thoth was supposed to be this magical book which could, it had power over life and death and resurrection, and this kind of ties back into where we're going, because the Book of Thoth is the inspiration for something called the Scroll of Thoth, which...
Carlos the Mummy.
Right, there we go. Now that comes back into the Mummy movies, and initially it was used in literature, Mummy literature. So that's where the whole Mummy thing started. But let's get back to the movie for a bit. We in, I think it was about 2015, this thing was announced. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And
well, I was just going to say the Dark Universe, as they kind of wanted to announce it.
Being a filmmaker, being familiar with the notion of shared universes, the big geeks that we are.
Yeah.
What was your take when you hear about the universal dark universe?
Interest, intrigue. I think. I mean, I've always loved the idea of crossovers. From being a kid, and you can have Batman and Superman. Oh my God, this is going to blow my mind. And in terms of Universal's kind of monster movies, they've always been kind of thought of as being part of a package, even though they were never really in the same thing of the same time or anything like that. So
yeah, I mean, Universal arguably created the shared universe, didn't they, with their first crossover movies?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole host of them, and then Hammer were doing the same kind of things. I believe I'm going to show a lot of my ignorance here, particularly on Egyptology. But yeah, so I like the idea. I like the principle of it, and then you're seeing with Marvel how you can kind of successfully make a shared universe of lots of different solo movie carrying characters coming together and being an ensemble that works. But then the other side of that interest is, how are you going to make Dracula and Frankenstein and the Mummy work in the same movie? Or are they even going to be in the same movie? Or is it, I mean, I wasn't particularly sure whether or not they were actually ever going to meet per se, or whether or not it was just this kind of umbrella term for this new wave of old school movies kind of making a resurgence.
Well, yeah.
Just because they're Dark Universe doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be in the same film. They're just connected by a new approach, a new tone and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a really good point to make, really, when we're looking at the idea of the Dark Universe. I can't believe they called it that. I mean, come on, who's writing this stuff? I started, you get that little GIF meme of the guy trying to do math and there's like symbols all over the screen. That's what my brain was doing. I was like, what? Tom Cruise in The Mummy? Tom Cruise is The Mummy? Where are they going with this?
I mean, I'd have watched that.
I would watch that movie.
I'm sold. There is I mean, it's always got to be about money. It always will be. At the end of the day, like imagination and creative integrity aside, it's got to be worthwhile. Otherwise you're never going to do it. And I mean, we're currently seeing remakes left, right, and center. So why not of the kind of the biggest monster franchises?
Yeah.
It wasn't until watching the movie. I mean, yeah, maybe that's just my naivety. It was while watching the movie where I was like, oh yeah, and spoiler alert. That should.
Yeah, we're going to spoil the shit out of this movie, by the way. So be prepared.
Well, actually, I mean, the trailer spoiled it in itself. I didn't know Jekyll was going to be in it, and that would have been a great reveal. Stupid in its own way, maybe, but it kind of. But then seeing the trailer, it's like, oh, well, I see what you're doing now, and so I didn't know until that point that they were kind of creating the basis for a shared universe. And arguably, yeah, this is the beginning of a franchise setting, which it didn't need to be. I think for me, that's the main falling point for this film. In terms of narratively is the kind of if they just took out that subplot, it would have been more worthwhile. It would have been more interesting. They could have spent a lot more time on the actual plot.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? And I mean, I think it's worth getting into some of the plot points and the details of the film, just so that we can pull out some of the things therein. But I feel like just starting off on a bad foot here, because they decide it's a shared universe before they've got the first film even out. I mean, even Warner Brothers weren't that impatient. You know, they at least had Man of Steel out before they thought, well, let's bring Batman into this and maybe we'll cram some others into there. But they had Man of Steel first.
Yeah.
This is even before Man of Steel. This is like them saying, well, this is going to be the start of our shared universe.
Well, it's weird. It's a weird one because that's the thing. Like, we can see Marvel have done it amazingly well, but then they, as opposed to DC, sadly, where, you know, it has every right to be just as good, but it is kind of, it feels rushed. Whereas with something like this, if that's your intention, you don't need to rush it. You know what you're going to be building towards. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it betrays kind of a lack of confidence in what they've got in a way, or an overconfidence in what they've got, rather, and a lack of confidence in the source material. But
potentially, yeah.
But that's probably a tangent for another time.
Yeah.
Moving on to Tom Cruise.
Well, so I'm gonna I don't know, embarrass myself probably. I actually quite liked him. I like Tom Cruise, to be fair. Like, I think, no, I liked his character. Like, or in terms of, he's not a likable character. He's not your typical Tom Cruise part. He's quite cowardly, and he kind of is doing heroic things by accident. And the moments where those kind of are shown off are great, I think. Like the selfishness at the beginning.
So let's talk about that. So after we get several minutes of preamble, much like one of my podcasts, we have exposition. We have Templars in England. So the movie opens with Templars in England, and I'm thinking, what? Why are we in England? This is interesting. Okay, and then
I was going to ask you about that, if that was a thing. Well, not Templars in England, just were they ever?
Sorry, you know what? They're Crusaders. They're not Templars. My bad. So we open with Crusaders in England.
But to be fair, like it is misleading in that sense, because Templars are notorious for stealing of antiquities, or at least hoarding of antiquities, or religious antiquities, and
hoarding / protecting.
Yes.
Ancient things. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's where my brain has kind of convoluted the two together, because I came away from it thinking it was Templars on my initial viewing, and then I went back and looked at it and I was like, oh no, hang on, they're Crusaders, and they've apparently taken this dagger whilst on their crusades through the quote-unquote Holy Lands, somehow ended up in Egypt. Or, I mean, where was the dagger? I don't know. Did we find that out? I mean, it wasn't buried with her, clearly, because that would be stupid. But where was it? They'd taken it back from Egypt somewhere, I guess, is the plot point.
Yeah, they never explain where the dagger was.
They don't, do they? So...
Or why they had it.
Why they've taken it.
Or why they knew to lock it up.
How did they know about this thing? If she was wiped out of history, how do these Crusader knights from England know to take this dagger and keep it in a reliquary in a church in Britain? I mean, for me, there's your first big plot hole.
It was just a pretty knife.
It's a pretty knife.
He was just holding it.
Pretty. We're gonna hide it.
Okay, he found it, loved it. They buried him with it.
Let's talk about the knife for a second. It looks like it's made out of maybe obsidian or something like that, or some kind of volcanic glass kind of thing, maybe, which kind of fits because the ancient Egyptians would use these kind of blades in the process of, funnily enough, mummification. Copper knives weren't sharp enough to do as experimental archaeology has shown us. Copper knives, it seems, and the copper tools is what they had at the start of Egyptian civilization, weren't sharp enough to cut through the body. So they would use these, sharp stones or volcanic glass or that kind of thing. And that would actually, depending on the period of history, and that would cut through the flesh nicely. It's much, much sharper than metal. Mm-hmm. So that, if that is the case, fine. Ruby in the hilt, don't really get rubies or precious stones of any kind in ancient Egypt. Not until quite a lot later than... Okay, and here's another thing before we get into the chronology of this film, all right? Mm-hmm. So Egyptology is represented in this film by the character Dr. Jennifer... I don't know what her surname is, actually. It's gone from my brain. That's how memorable this character is. So Dr. Jennifer, who is no Evie from my original mummy, Dr. Jennifer describes these artifacts, the sarcophagus, the mummies, etc., as being either 5,000 years old or 2,000 years old. It seems like she can't really decide. Whoever wrote the script can't really decide. She's also, it seems, from the New Kingdom. So if that's the case, the New Kingdom, we're looking at about 3,000 years ago.
Do they not mention her, the mummy herself, her father?
Yes, they do, and he has. I'm glad you brought this up, Chris. I'm glad you asked. King Muneptra. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
So, New Kingdom is about 3,500 years ago at most. Yeah. Mm-hmm. King Muneptra isn't a king that we know of. It may be a take. Both of these names, I should state at the beginning, both of these names are kind of made up. So Muneptra might be a take on one of the names. So all of the pharaohs of Egypt had 5 names, 4 titles, so to speak. And Menpeti-Ra was one of the names of Ramesses I.
Interesting. Okay.
So it's possible that they've taken Menpeti-Ra, and this has happened all the way back into the literature that spawned the first mummy stories. They would just take these ideas, these vague names, and then they would, just run with it. And then you see that happening in the mummy movies as well. So like Caris the mummy. What's Caris? That's not an Egyptian name whatsoever. Is it actually an amalgamation of Boris Karloff's 2 names?
Yeah, maybe. Almost certainly.
Maybe, So Caris the mummy, the shambling monster of the Hammer fame and earlier movies, in fact, doesn't have an Egyptian name. Neither of these guys actually really have Egyptian names. So she's called Amenet. Now, there is another version of Amenet, spelled a different way. Amenet is the name of a goddess. She is the goddess, the other half, the reflection or consort of the god Amun, which means the hidden one. So that's kind of appropriate. If she is Amenet, that means the female hidden one. Okay. And she's been hidden away for anything between 5,000 and 2,000 years, according to our resident Egyptologist, who apparently thinks the New Kingdom happened 5,000 years ago. But just to be clear, 5,000 years ago would be the very start of Egyptian pharaonic civilization as we recognize it.
That would have been off to a bad start.
So that's Old Kingdom.
Okay, so playing devil's advocate slightly.
Sure.
How important is it that these things are made up? Like, we watch movies with made up characters all the time. If they're... I mean, it's a mummy movie. It's not... It's not a it's not even trying to be a documentary, but it's not even... It doesn't... How historically accurate does it need to be within a mummy movie, like a fantasy horror?
You know what? I think that's a really great question and a really important point, because I think a lot of Egyptologists do get caught up on this idea that these things are quote unquote, frustratingly inaccurate. And that's something I read in a book recently dealing with mummy movies. They don't have to be accurate. They don't have to be anything of the kind. However, there is something I think it's worth bearing in mind when we are piling fantasy upon illusion, when it comes to real civilizations, real people, and real subjects. arguably, movies like this are the biggest touch point for people with Egyptology.
Yeah.
So, as an Egyptologist, I can see how people would get upset with the notion of, well, all of this is grossly inaccurate. It paints a very inaccurate picture of what was an incredibly important civilization, and it helps to spread the kinds of disinformation that we as Egyptologists deal with on, I mean, such a frequent basis, so often. So I can see how it's frustrating. Now, these things don't bother me because I accept them as fantasy, and I've enjoyed and played and worked in the realms of fiction and fantasy myself enough to appreciate the difference and the nuances of writing a script where you don't want to be bound to those historical things because you want to create a good story. And I think if you're going to create a good story, so much the better, more power to you. But if you're not going to do that, you can at least make it accurate.
Well, I mean, for me, I would want it to be as historically accurate as it can be, really, because why not? So names, I think you can have grace with names. So different names. It's not necessarily a specific king.
Absolutely.
Because why? That's nebulous. But in terms of kind of dynasty and periods and things like that, and stylings, like, it's lazy to not, you know, and arguably the more research you do, maybe the better story you'll get, the better ideas and things like that.
And that brings up another interesting issue, is that when I was researching this film and I sat through those, you know, the long crawl, the graveyard of the titles right at the end, trying to find an Egyptologist in there or a researcher or some name to try and figure out who had provided them, because they actually use the ancient Egyptian language in this film. Some research has clearly been done. They use the language, I'm gonna put accurately in air quotes, because obviously there are different interpretations and what's being said doesn't always exactly match the screen, but it's close enough, you know? So they're using the ancient Egyptian language. They clearly had someone on board who understood hieroglyphs at the very least, but clearly didn't want their name associated with the final product.
Well, I can imagine it being incredibly frustrating to provide that kind of knowledge and information, and then that would be definitely frustrating to see it mishandled and misrepresented and tweaked on a whim by people wanting to make it fit their own narrative. Yeah. I think there just needs to be, there's space for a common ground where you can be accurate and fantastical at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then, you know, I find it, if you don't like something already, then it's much easier to find those flaws. Like, I don't know how accurate Indiana Jones is to a lot of these things, but...
And that's a fair point. That's a very fair point. I mean, that's a really good point, and maybe worth making that comparison a little bit, because the original... I say original. I'm going to keep referring to the Stephen Sommers 1999 flick as the original, because for me that kind of is. That's the Mummy movie that got me on board. But that movie's not accurate, but I love it, and everyone loves it. And I say everyone loosely. You know, most Egyptologists I speak to and people interested in the ancient world love that movie, and they don't care that it's inaccurate. So you make a very good point.
But that, I mean, what's interesting with that one is that it is very much kind of an adventure story. It's a kind of family-friendly, fun.
Yeah.
It doesn't treat Egyptology or Egyptologists like a fool either. It's just having a lot of fun and kind of introductory to a kind of topic without necessarily trying to be accurate.
Do you think the existence of those movies and the obviously indelible kind of imprint they made on culture, let alone on this kind of movie at the time, I mean, they were huge. Do you think the existence of those kind of muddies the waters for this reboot, even this far into the millennium?
In terms of what? In terms of what they were trying to do?
In terms of the fact that people had this notion set in their minds of what the Mummy franchise is, and suddenly they're told, you've got Tom Cruise and it's horror now.
Well, see, I don't know. I thought, from it being Dark Universe and the announcement of the other movies within that, so Creature from Black Lagoon, Frankenstein, Dracula, that they were, and that they wanted to make them horror, this dark kind of thing. They were going to go back to the 30s to the original Universal ones.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for me, the fact that it was kind of straddling both films, it was kind of adventurous with the big set pieces and the kind of, sandstorm with a skull face kind of thing.
Yeah.
Very, very much from the Summers movies, but then the tone and kind of sensibilities trying to go that darker horror from earlier. Interestingly, watching the Karloff one subsequently, it's a very different movie.
Oh yeah.
Like kind of narratively more in keeping with the Stephen Summers ones with Imhotep and Alex on the Moon and kind of.
Well, yeah, I mean the core themes are totally different, really, in so many ways. Because the core themes in this, from what I can understand, are, I think, vengeance. I think violation.
Yeah, I mean, in the original one and the Stephen Summers one, it's, I guess you could say their plot is love transcending time, basically. They're very specific in the Karloff one. It's been 3,700 years.
Yep.
Interesting, I guess this is a bit of a tangent, but that one's not a monster movie, really. He's just kind of a guy. You see the mummy at the beginning, and then he's 10 years later, and he's just pretending to be a normal Egyptian guy. But it's about him trying to bring his lover back to life and using the Scroll of Thoth.
Yep.
Whereas this one was just kind of, she was a child that was going to get everything, and then had a baby brother and got jealous and killed everybody, tried to take control, and then failed, and now wants to do what?
Well, let's get into that, because that is kind of the next point. So in the exposition at the opening of the film, we get the Crusaders, England, then suddenly we're in modern England, the stagger's been found, and then we're taken back to ancient Egypt by Russell Crowe, giving us the exposition daily and talking about Amenet, this Egyptian princess. Now, her actions from the start, we don't have any kind of notion of this sympathetic mummy, really. She's a sociopathic mummy, certainly, but all of her initial actions are based on the idea of basically entitlement. I should be the ruler. You've ruined my plan, so I'm going to kill you and this innocent kid and your new wife. And it's all very vengefully, and then she makes this pact with, quote unquote, the god of death, which is inaccurate, but the god Set. And apparently she needs to make this pact with Set to do the thing she's already done by killing her own family. And why does she need Set to rule? I mean, why does she need Set to rule? Why does she need a host for Set for all this to happen when she's quite clearly capable of killing people on her own and taking over?
Yeah, I mean, the inference is that Set will make her powerful. So, I mean, if she's killed everybody, is she going to actually be crowned? Or are they going to kill her?
Okay, so here's the thing. Historically, there's precedent for that. There were rulers who, especially in the Ptolemaic era, which was the later Greek Macedonian era, there were rulers who were just offing their siblings and their parents left, right, and center. I kid you not, it was ugly. Now,
Crusader Kings stuff.
it was crazy. So there is precedent for that. Now, earlier in Egypt, I'm trying to think if there's any precedent for that in dynastic Egypt itself. Certainly there were plots. There's a famous plot against Ramesses III, where one of his quote-unquote lesser wives, so they had the great wife, who was the queen, so to speak, and they had lesser wives who were, part of the royal harem. The idea of this was to ensure the maximum chance of having a suitable heir to ensure the stability of your royal dynasty. And in the reign of Ramesses III, there is a famous plot. This plot was basically by one of these lesser wives to off Ramesses III so her child can be crowned. And so that kind of implies a number of things. That implies that at the time, at least in that period, there was enough belief there in the idea of the royal line that the legitimate heir, no matter what they'd done, was still the legitimate heir. Whether that would be seen through is another question.
I mean, yeah, and you also get into the realm of, we know about it, or if they did it, but did we know that they did it at the time, I guess.
Absolutely.
And that obviously I have no idea. Oh, and I don't know about how kind of guilt and trials and ancient Egyptology.
Okay, so this actually brings us very nicely onto the next point, which is mummification as punishment. And this is something we see in the Summers film and we see in this film. Mummification, probably the highest honor you can receive in ancient Egypt, not a punishment.
Yeah, but then they make the point in both of them, which is that
Dom die.
Well, that it's typically of high honor, so that then when you have one that's kind of
inverted,
I guess you imply it's the opposite. It's the worst thing you could do. I mean, being buried alive would suck, but having your organs ripped out through your nose would suck. But then,
I mean, you're not really going to be alive through that. I'm guessing as soon as someone whisks up your brains, you're pretty much out of it. Yeah, I mean that's an interesting point, and I do concede the point that I suppose you could see an inversion of that practice as being a punishment, but certainly no record of it there. What is interesting though, and what I thought one of the things that made me think that they might have consulted someone or they just got lucky, her being moved off of Egyptian soil, her being buried in Iraq, that is significant because the Egyptians believed that if you died when you weren't on Egyptian soil, if you weren't brought back to Egypt and buried there, you couldn't access the afterlife. You could only access the afterlife. It was like one exit from the motorway, and it was in Egypt. And if you weren't there, you missed it, and you were screwed. You couldn't get there. So the idea of her being taken to Iraq and buried on foreign soil, and this is a very long way away as well, ensuring that she cannot get to the afterlife, that is the punishment itself. Yeah. That's a big old punishment. And then, of course, we get to the point where we're now with our quote-unquote cheeky chappy liberator of precious antiquities. Not a tomb robber. He's a liberator of precious antiquities.
But then that is very much tongue-in-cheek in itself.
Absolutely.
Self-aware, right?
It's self-aware in a sense, and I think it's a really interesting, possibly missed opportunity, because if we look at his story as a redemption narrative, which it kind of is, his arc is he's going from this bad guy who steals things he's not supposed to, who violates these places, who personally profits off of them, into, I don't know what he is, and neither does he actually. He actually says that, but I don't want to get too far ahead. But his arc seems to be one of, he's this awful guy, he's a coward, like you say, and he kind of accidentally becomes a hero.
Yeah, but then arguably it ends very much where it began, with them riding off into the desert to presumably liberate more antiquities.
Do you think that's what they're doing? Is that your take on that?
I think it's unclear. And that arguably is a problem. I mean, no, you get the impression that it would be to actually liberate or protect or something.
That's interesting. That's not something I took away from that ending.
I mean, I think it's muddied by what you said earlier, which is what is the motivation of kind of anything, really. Like, her plan, so she's killed everybody to bring Set to life, but then how does she get the powers to become the mummy when they because it's not a curse that the Egyptians would have put on the tomb to, oh yeah, if you open this, bring her back as a demon. So where do her powers come from? And then her motivation is to still bring Set to life, to give more power, in theory, to Tom Cruise. And there's no real explanation for that. But then you also, as you say, they start her off as this kind of sociopathic person, but then with the introduction of Jekyll, and you're kind of a little bit sympathetic for her, I guess, purely from the imagery of her being bound in chains and
of her being bound up. Yeah. Before we move on, I feel like it is my archaeological duty to point out that, you know, there's a very real phenomenon of black market antiquities in Iran and Iraq. It's been happening at an exponential scale since, since, you know, Saddam was toppled and the museum at Baghdad was quote unquote emptied. It wasn't, but so many, many, many thousands of objects went, and many, many thousands of objects have been dug out of the ground since in these areas that are, you know, not being watched, no longer policed, and don't have any protection. So for me, watching this as an archaeologist, I thought there was a real missed opportunity there. The fact that they're addressing it kind of at the start. What they're addressing really is the more recent destruction and these kinds of extremist activities where we have the destruction of cultural history on a massive scale in the Middle East. The destruction of Nimrod, you know, comes to mind as one of the most recent. And we're seeing just wholesale. And it's because, of course, it attracts attention on the one hand. So we have this notion of the destruction of cultural history, and we have these opportunists kind of caught up in the middle of it. Opportunists who, and I'm glad you pointed out that it is very muddy, because they're opportunists who don't necessarily seem to have learned a lesson from that initial violation. And this kind of comes full circle round to the idea of the curse. Because the curse itself, as you noted, you know, this is the effects of what's going on with her isn't a curse that's been put on her. The notion of the curse is something I think worth bringing up before we go any further. Because the curse originates in Western literature. There are very few, there are maybe 3, I think, curses recorded from tombs in ancient Egypt. But the idea of the curse is very, very powerful. So, in a historical sense, we have something called a prohibition, or a script of prohibition, which is on the tomb of someone called Hesi. Okay, and this is basically him saying, if you come into my tomb and you are someone who has done a taboo act, then, you know, you will be punished. And if you've been an adulterer, if you've, you know, eaten things like pork, you know, forbidden foods, then, you know, you will be punished in this world or the next, kind of thing. And that's basically what his tomb is saying. However, these things were twofold, where they do exist. They also bless the name of somebody who comes to the tomb to preserve the name of that tomb's occupant. So just going to a tomb and going inside it, so to speak, isn't necessarily something worthy of being cursed, because you're coming out and the idea is, you know, in a way, Egyptologists are kind of protected from curse narrative in the sense that they are there to preserve the name. They are there to, in theory at least, even though they may violate the sanctity of the wholeness of the tomb. So it's really interesting the way that the curse narrative develops over time, because it comes out of this thing, which is an idea. It's an idea of a kind of mythologized Orientalist position on this discourse on taboo and transgression of tombs, and it recasts these objections, quite fair local objections to tomb robbing, as something that's, you know, supernatural, something that's malignant, something that's irrational. That's the idea. That's where the Western notion of the tomb curse radiates from, and of course explodes onto the scene after the death of Lord Carnarvon and the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun. Now, There are lots of historical reasons. I won't go into them right now, but it's fair to say that this curse was cemented in Western mythology because of that episode. There were reasons and motivations for papers to do that at the time. Mm-hmm. You got a question there. I can see it.
I do. No, I was wondering whether or not, is this something that feeds into the kind of alternative archaeologists that you were, or alternative Egyptologists that you were referring to right at the very start, or whether or not it's an idea that's kind of proliferated by them, this kind of mystical
Egypt. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the case.
It feeds into itself.
Yeah, it does. It does, and like lots of things feed into it as well. So all of our pop culture feeds into it, and then it's like this great self-perpetuating machine of, again, piling fantasy on illusion. That's a quote from a book called Consuming Ancient Egypt, it's got a great article on the history of the notion of the mummy and the curse and mummy literature and mummy movies, which I kind of had to dive into before we did this, which is why I'm waxing so academic about some of these points. Sorry about that.
That's fair. No, but I think, I mean, again, flip side, it is that side of things being so unusual, is very interesting. It's very engaging, and fine, a film like this is most people's introduction to kind of Egyptology. It's not accurate, but then it is getting a lot of people interested in a ancient period, into a topic, into something that will always need further study and recognition, especially at a time now where you're seeing lots of, as you say, antiquities being destroyed. You can arguably bring people into, or at least give them an understanding of why that's important.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, yeah, it's misleading, but then you kind of got to hope that they'll kind of believe that. Or, ancient aliens. It was all...
Yeah, ancient aliens. Yeah, I mean, ancient aliens let's not even go there, actually. But, it's a problem. It is a problem. You're absolutely right to say that the pop culture, however accurate or inaccurate, potentially does feed into the other pursuits, the more, perhaps more academic pursuits, or the more closely tied to heritage and preservation and stuff like that. It absolutely does, and I've always believed that, and that's why I kind of believe in reaching out and talking to these people and talking about these things rather than just naysaying and poo-pooing them and brushing over them, because I think we can't afford to do that, realistically speaking, in a field that relies as much on public goodwill as Egyptology does, and public interaction and public discourse. We really absolutely need to be engaging with these things, and I think it's great that they exist no matter what form they come in, for the most part, apart from aliens.
Well,
draw the line at ancient aliens.
But you see, I mean, similar things with, King Arthur, legend versus history.
Yeah.
It's interesting, it's engaging, kind of, and then to have fun with it and see how they can mix and create something new. But then you do have to step back and be like, yeah, that's not real.
Yeah.
That didn't happen. This might have done. But it's fantastical and interesting. And yeah, again, if it gets people interested into it, then it's not really...
It's not harmful necessarily.
Exactly. I can't see it as a bad thing.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. So, talking of knights...
Well, sorry, just
loose link back into the movie. So...
Sorry, just to go back to your point about the curse.
Yeah.
I mean, interestingly, with both films, The Summers and this one, I mean, I referred to it as curse, but they don't really curse anybody. I mean, Tom Cruise isn't cursed.
No.
He's just chosen.
Yeah. There's no real curse in this film.
No, but even in the Summers one, he's magical, is he not?
It's the hum die that gives him the magic power, though, because that's what they say at the beginning. It was the worst punishment, and they called it the hum die, which was in everything. But in everything but name, it is a curse. But you're right that she doesn't get her powers the same way. There is no curse attached to this too. I mean, in a way, it's a loose riff on the curse narrative that she has made a pact, a quote-unquote demonic pact, because they seem to be equating Set with a death deity, which technically isn't true. He was a chaos deity, certainly, sometimes a harmful deity, sometimes a benevolent deity, and his role changes throughout the history of Egypt. So just to clarify on that point, Set isn't a god of death. There are gods who deal with the spheres of death in ancient Egypt, and they're not evil, quote unquote, at all. Death was seen as part of the natural progression of moving from, the process of moving from this world to the next, to eternal life. Death was part of the process. As Imhotep himself says at the end of The Mummy, spoilers, death is only the beginning. So, and that was a fair belief of the ancient Egyptians. So a death deity from Egypt wouldn't be inherently evil. But to us, of course, we have a different relationship with death, a different conception of it. And to us, anything that's a death god must therefore be evil.
Yeah. Well, she does kill and turn people into mummies. So
yeah, let's get into that.
I find it weird that you would curse someone and give them powers.
Absolutely.
Even in the Summers film,
in a way, they addressed that, didn't they?
Yeah, did they?
Well, kind of. In a sense that in the Summers film, it's like, well, why would you do that? Because all you've done is just make things way, way worse.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
In this film, they've gone, okay, you're already powerful. You've got this pact with this demon god that you're trying to bring into the world. We're gonna put you in a box underground on foreign soil and forget about you. That's all we need. So in a way, they actually did something smarter than the previous films in that they didn't make the curse, the result of someone else's actions. It was her actions.
Yeah. She has cursed herself.
She's cursed herself. She's created this pact, and that's what gives her power. But then they put her in this tomb with liquid mercury. No historical precedent for that in ancient Egypt. Just thought I'd put that out there.
I was going to ask.
Yeah. So that tomb. This is interesting because it's probably a mummy movie with the least amount of actual Egyptian-looking stuff in it that I've seen to date. Even though some of the old Karis the Mummy films were a bit wonky and had some kind of, South American cheap sets in them that they'd repainted and painted hieroglyphs onto, etc. But in this case, we have some very un-Egyptian-looking stuff.
Well, it's a film that, despite being the Mummy, is like 95% not in Egypt. So it's in Iraq, it's in England.
Yeah. What's that about?
Yeah,
there's literally there's no answer to that. Like, why do we only have Egypt in exposition and exposition flashback? And this is the bit that really gets me. Tom Cruise's visions.
Well, he's chosen. He's chosen through time.
Yeah, he's the chosen one. He's Setep Ai.
Yep.
They really belabor that point as well. Setep Ai. It's actually reasonable ancient Egyptian. Setep does mean to choose. Setep I. So, yeah. Okay. So that's kind of right. We don't really know. It's another little Egyptological fun fact for you. We don't really know how vowel sounds were pronounced. So there's this tradition in Egyptology to just stick an E in there. So every vowel sound becomes an E. So that's kind of becomes quite inaccurate. We can extrapolate a bit from Coptic, which is a language which probably has the most ancient Egyptian surviving in it today. So when they say it's a dead language, it's not exactly dead. The script, the hieroglyphic script. Well, that's the point. She calls them hieroglyphics. So he's like, I'm jumping forward in the story here. They find this tomb, this very un-Egyptian tomb in Iraq.
Yep.
An Egyptologist just happens to be there. But I suppose when you look at it in retrospect, she's there because Henry has planted this thing so that she will go and he's given her this note, which he's stolen because she was supposed to check out that site. So she ends up at that site.
Yeah, she was going anyway. Tom Cruise has just jumped the gun.
Yeah.
To liberate on her behalf.
So what's interesting about that, I suppose, is that she turns up. She's got all this equipment, so clearly they were planning to do a major excavation because they've got lights, they've got ropes, they've got all kinds of crap. They've got all this stuff, and then he's almost like a Lethal Weapon angry captain, the general, who's like, you know, okay, you get in the hole because you found this thing, and I'm going to send in the 2 least appropriate special ops guys I can, who have a proven track record of stealing antiquities and have connections to the black market. Those are the guys I'm sending in with you.
Yeah. Who just blew up a town.
Who just blew up an entire town. Yeah. That's fine, apparently. And all of those soldiers then take this sarcophagus, which she calls 5,000 years old at the time, which I don't just know, and they attach it to the bottom of a helicopter by a chain. This thing, this priceless object, the only intact tomb found in the last century almost. Not quite a century, to be fair. Tutankhamun was, 1922, he says, stretching his brain muscles around then. So almost a century. And there was one more intact tomb, but we'll get to that another time. And then they put the sarcophagus in a plane. There's the Hitchcock ripoff of the birds smashing up the plane. Any thoughts on this as a filmmaker? What this device is about?
I don't know. I mean, in the same way that in the Stephen Sommers, the mummy can control external forces, supernatural powers, control over beasts and things like that. So
it's quite Dracula as well, isn't it? I suppose.
Yeah,
control
exactly.
over
it's
beasts in the sky.
You can start to get quite. I guess this is where I have difficulty because in a film that's quite obviously fantasy, at what point do you stop nitpicking? So you can say, they've not actually opened her tomb yet. They just he shot a chain, and it lowered or whatever. So is she awake yet? At what point is she awake? He's certainly had his vision, so I guess she's awake.
Yeah, so he has this vision.
The point of saying they're guiding her to London. But,
So in theory, she's always awake then. She's been in there awake the whole time in this kind of living death, in theory.
No wonder she's grumpy.
Yeah, I mean, the mercury's been drained, so I suppose maybe that means her powers are coming back, and that's what's happening there.
I mean, you have to take it all with a pinch of sand. Hey.
So,
but, you need to kind of give them some...
I'm willing to cut them some slack.
Yeah,
on
some
that.
License there.
I think that the whole plane zero gravity stunt thing possibly more influenced by Mission Impossible movies than mummy movies, but
so I think that's for me from that kind of filmmaking side of things, or at least from the film side of things. It's a very muddled the film has a very muddled tone. You've kind of got his humor, which is great, and that's quite Brendan Fraser. He's not a particularly heroic. Well, he is kind of heroic, he is very heroic, but he's kind of in it for himself at the beginning of the Stephen Sommers Mummy.
Brendan Fraser's character. Yeah, he is.
He's helping them to help himself kind of thing. And then he becomes the hero.
Accidental hero, yeah.
Exactly. So it's quite muddled in terms of he's kind of comedy, but then also actiony. But, you're trying to make a dark movie. Why have you got these kind of big set pieces, this big action? They're two different films. One's kind of adventurous and bombastic, and then you have other moments that are quite spooky, and it doesn't straddle both worlds very well. Which is a shame, because I think there are nice action sequences in it. There are a lot of kind of unusual moments. The way that's shot is very nicely, the plane bit with them rolling kind of all around in the zero-G. The car crash in the woods where he's kind of thrown out the car, and it's all very unbelievable, but you get away with it because he's already dead, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's definitely something to be said for the fact that from a technical standpoint, without question, there's a lot of good work went into making this film. And I always really do. And having worked on a few sets myself and knowing how much work goes into even a small, tiny production, I really feel for the people who work on these films who come out the other end and get 15% aggregated scores on Rotten Tomatoes. That's rough. That's really rough.
Well, it makes you wonder. I mean, I've had this where you're making something and it just goes through so many hoops. The film is then not what it started out as. So, okay, yeah, great. We're going to reboot all our old school monster movies. We're going to make them dark. We're going to make them edgy. But then you kind of, whether it's a corporate hoop or whatever, yeah, but the Stephen Sommers ones, they were big adventurous and they made loads of money. So let's take it in that direction as well. And we'll get Tom Cruise while he's a big action movie star. We can get some Mission Impossible style stunts and things going. And if the first script is arguably going to have been and then they want to tie them all together with these other movies that they're going to be making. Okay, so we'll write that into the script as well.
Studio imposition. Exactly.
So it would be interesting to see how different the original script is to the final script. What changed? How not historically accurate, I imagine it probably wasn't, but kind of where that tone got lost, where I imagine it had goodwill all the way through, but where it lost its way and
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there does feel like there was a turning point. You have the makings of a mummy movie up to this point where they're in Britain. And, he's like, they have the plane crash. He technically dies, but he doesn't die because he's now the chosen one. Fine, I guess, because he's the one that shot the thing, because he shot the chain, because he had a vision of her in ancient Egypt. And
I just got the impression he was impatient.
I think maybe
they had to get out of there.
Yeah, I think maybe they kind of muddied the waters themselves a little bit on that by having him have those visions kind of before. If they'd saved the visions until a bit later, we could have seen his motivations would have been perhaps a little bit clearer from the start, but instead we have them really early on into the establishment of his character. So we kind of get the impression, or at least I was left with the impression, that he's acting on her behalf pretty much like from that moment in the tomb where he decides he's going to shoot the thing to let her out. That's her being in his head, quote unquote. As Dr. Jennifer Bland, I don't know what her surname is. She's very bland. I'm sure she's a competent actor and everything, but they just, oh my God, what were they thinking with that character? Just the worst. I mean, she calls them hieroglyphics. I didn't finish that point. So he dies. And spoiler alert, he dies, but he's not dead. And then he wakes up in a morgue, and we have the kind of, comedy, I'm naked in a morgue. And this riff on, it's kind of the American Werewolf in London, where his dead friend shows up.
Yeah, that wasn't particularly clear to me.
Yeah, I mean, what is, it's Jake Johnson, the actor, right?
Yeah, because he's kind of possessed on the plane. Because
he was bitten by a camel spider, from what I saw.
Yeah.
Under her control, I guess. Something like that?
Yeah. Sure, why not? Let's go with that. But then I think that being quite cynical, sure, why not? The film kind of has that tone to certain details.
I mean, I didn't really understand why he goes from having been bitten by a camel spider, which they establish is not a poisonous thing, to then he's dying on the plane, presumably from this bite, to waking up and being a zombie. Now, there's an interesting kind of muddy area here between mummy zombies and the establishment of the zombie genre, which maybe you'll have more to riff on yourself. So yeah, we have Jake Johnson kind of coming on board as like this weird zombie American Werewolf in London style, I'm your dead friend, you can see me, no one else can kind of thing. I thought it was funny, to be fair, at first. I didn't mind it because he's quite a charming, funny guy. He's not a bad actor for that role. Bit cliche, maybe.
Yeah, I liked his part at the beginning, and it was a shame when he died. So it's nice to see him come back. But then again, he tonally seems at odds with himself. So he's kind of, on the one hand, you need to do this. This is what she wants, blah, 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 blah. And then subsequently like, oh, this is a crazy ride. We're going to, you know, and it's like, well, which are you? Are you possessed by her, or are you yourself? Or I guess the implication towards the end is that he's kind of both, but I don't know. That's
a really, really
he
good
seems
point,
quite
because it's really uneven, isn't it? It's like on the one hand, right at the start, he's just like, there's no trace of him when he's alive and possessed, and then they kill him and he's funny again, and then he's not, and then he is. And
well, I quite liked the. I don't know if I liked it at the time. I don't know if it occurred to me. I can't make it wrong.
This movie's like really bad sex, guys. Looking back at it, I'm glad I had sex, but I didn't enjoy it at the time.
I mean, I guess what I really mean is it didn't occur to me at the time. But subsequently, at the start, he's very much, I don't want to be doing this. This is a terrible idea. Why are you dragging me into these things? You're such a nightmare. You suck. And then it becomes look what you did. You've killed me. You suck. You've always dragged me into these things. But then it does become it's going to be great. She's going to make the world a new thing. She's amazing. Awesome. And he kind of goes on with it. So there's a change in him, which is quite interesting. Not necessarily fully explored. You know, is that more him than it is the writing? I don't know. It was a weird choice. It didn't really add anything having him in it. It was that like relief kind of part. It gave Tom Cruise some things to riff off, you know. The scene in the bathroom when they're in the pub on a cobbled English street.
Yeah, how cliched is England in this film?
Of course we have loads.
Apparently, according to them, England is empty and hasn't been built up in the last 200 years.
Again, I don't know how much I want to nitpick, but, you know, they run out of the Natural History Museum onto the Millennium Bridge. But then, you know, how many American movies do I watch? And then I have no idea of the actual geography.
Let's be fair. Wasn't Kurtzman behind Transformers 2, where they literally run from, like, I think it's like Jordan or something, to Egypt in the space of 5 minutes on foot? It's all the Middle East. It's all the same. Right?
Yeah.
So
it's just over the sand dune.
It's all
to the
Britain.
left.
It's small. You can walk anywhere in no time.
Yeah. And it's, you know, it's not the first film to do that. It won't be the last. So I don't really have any.
No, it's to be expected.
It's just in a film when there are so many inconsistencies and inaccuracies that draw your attention, it's not hard to just add it to the list. And it's a shame because, you know, it doesn't need to be that way. I should point out, by the way, probably should have started with this, but the first time watching this movie, I fell asleep.
Oh, disclaimer.
Yeah.
Actually, let's set the context for that, because the first time I watched this movie, it was when I was staying in this tiny vintage caravan in a freezing cold field for our mutual friend Ed's wedding in England. And it was the only cold in England, which means it was 5 minutes away, but, you know, several hours drive. But we could have
round the corner from
that's right. We could have stepped out of the Natural History Museum and been right there and been beyond Stonehenge. That's a good reference point, actually. It wasn't far from Stonehenge, I suppose. So it's the only cold weekend of the entire summer, and I'm in a vintage caravan that has absolutely no thermal insulation, and I'm lying under the bed, mummified myself because it's so freaking cold, and I'm watching this film, which I have on Flickster. I support the film industry. I hold my hand up. I support the film industry. I didn't want to spend money on this film, but I paid for a legal download code to watch this movie. Mm-hmm. I downloaded it on Flickster, and I'm lying like a mummy in this caravan watching this thing, and I was a little bit maybe drunk and a little bit out of it, and I think that's why I didn't hate it.
Well, I'm glad. Wait, you didn't hate it?
No, I didn't. For all my critiques, I didn't hate it. It's not my favourite by a long shot, but I didn't hate it.
I didn't hate it either. I mean, like...
This was meant to be, Chris. This was meant to be. But you fell asleep.
Yeah. I fell asleep the first time. So, but that wasn't the film's fault, I'm going to say. I mean, it doesn't happen often. Terminator Genesis was the one before.
No, I haven't even seen that one, which is strange because the Carlise is in it, and
let's make that could be the next podcast. It's about as
un-Egyptian as it gets,
as the Mummy. So, but yeah, no, I was actually looking forward to it. I'm a Tom Cruise fan.
Big reveal. It's all coming out today.
Yeah, God, can he make a bad film?
Let's take that aside for a second. I wasn't happy with his casting in this because I didn't think it fit. I couldn't see him in that role. Once I saw it, I almost want to say pleasantly surprised. Like,
well, I think for me, I assumed he was never going to be the Mummy. He was going to be a hero of some kind. So I assumed he was going to be the Brendan Fraser style.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Lovable hero. And what I liked about it and was pleasantly surprised at was he was more roguish than lovable. It was very uncharacteristic of him. He's slightly not dumb or dim, but just like very gung ho without thinking.
Yeah, he's kind of an arse.
He's the opposite of Ethan Hunt, basically, who can never really do any wrong. Here, he's constantly just a jerk, and very much, I like the bit when he runs out of the church and they're both running their own way and he just does not care about.
Yeah. Yeah. But then I think he's reflecting the audience there because we don't care about her either, really, let's be honest. But yeah, there's this whole thing where like you've got this very convoluted decision making process where they come out of the pub, he survived death. He's like, I don't know. And then we get this nod towards her being part of something else, some big shady organization, because she phones in to report and she mentions this name, Henry, which we already saw in the letter. And I think most of the audience has put two and two together by now.
In the trailer.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's in the freaking trailer. So rather than wait for their post-credits Nick Fury scene, they decide to just slam Dr. Jekyll straight into this. But we haven't got there quite yet. So, and this is where I keep coming back to this bugbear of our resident Egyptologist describing them as hieroglyphics, not hieroglyphs. But I just have to make a differentiation. Right? The irony is that whilst she's correcting him, and he's saying, when we found that big box, and she's like, the sarcophagus. And he's like, yeah, and it's got all this like writing on it. And she's like, hieroglyphics. It's like, it's not hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphic, adjective. Yeah. Hieroglyphs, noun. They're hieroglyphs. But there you go. I've vented. I'm done. We're okay.
I mean,
it's all okay.
There's no inference that she's good at her job.
No, none whatsoever. She's like the worst.
Yeah.
She's no Evie. I'm telling you, man. She's no Evie.
She wouldn't have made that mistake.
Mm-hmm. I don't think she would have. I don't think she did. In fact, I'm going to have to rewatch just to find out.
Oh man, is that going to... That's going to ruin your childhood. You'll get there, she's going to say hieroglyphics and you'll be like, what the hell is this?
Dude, I'm like Tom Cruise. I was already an adult by the time that movie came out. I'm just like, okay, so then we get this convoluted conversation where she wrongly describes hieroglyphics, which I just won't let go of, and they end up at
bring it up.
They end up at this church, and the mummy, our mummy, who has now rejuvenated herself. This is interesting. We're getting back into mummy lore now. She's rejuvenated herself by kissing guys and sucking out their life force. There's some kind of Freudian something to be read in there, I'm sure, that's not good.
Does that happen in the Stephen Summers one?
Imhotep, the one kiss I remember is Imhotep kissing Rachel Weisz, Evie's character, but it's not to suck her juices out, it's to... because doesn't he like suck the other dude's juices out? This sounds really wrong. Doesn't he do that as a whirlwind rather than actually like touching them? He's just a whirlwind, and they get lifted up, and then they're desiccated. Triply. And then he comes back and he's got half a face, and then the music pipes up, and you know he's becoming Imhotep, the big bald bad. Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's the kiss of death. Classic. So.
This is true. In a sense, if you look back at H. Rider Haggard's story She, which is where the term "she who must be obeyed" comes from. You have the imprint, really, of what most of the Mummy stories, the themes that most of the Mummy stories refer to, are all there in that original story, where you have an immortal who is trying to basically resurrect, rekindle love with a reincarnated partner who is the hero of the movie. This is basically the template in one form or another for most of these films. Immortal love, reincarnation, another distinctly un-Egyptian theme. FYI, reincarnation is not an Egyptian notion.
What about the Scroll of Thoth?
Okay, so...
or the Book of Thoth?
I'm glad you asked. So there was... it's really interesting, actually, because there's a few stories. Some originally come from ancient Egypt. So you've got the story of Setna-Khamwas, who was one of the sons of Ramesses the Great, Ramesses II. Setna goes on all these adventures. Now, he's a historical figure. He's a real guy who was an Egyptologist, probably the first Egyptologist in the world. Because you've got to remember, by the time of the New Kingdom, the pyramids are already well over 1,000 years old. To them, ancient Egypt was ancient. It was ancient Egypt, ancient Kemet to them. So he's the first Egyptologist. Long story short, he has these adventures, and in one of them, he finds the Book of Thoth. And the Book of Thoth, I think, inspired some of the literature that came afterwards, which dealt with various things, quote unquote, of Thoth, which had to do with eternal life. So you've got one of the early ones is actually the author of Sherlock Holmes himself, Arthur Conan Doyle. He has a story called The Ring of Thoth, and that concerns a guy called Sosra. And this guy's lived since Egyptian times, and he's basically immortal because of an elixir that he developed. And I think there's kind of different traces of Rider Haggard, you know, the She story in there. And he gets wary of life because basically his love, who he had intended to spend eternity with, didn't take the elixir of immortality at the same time she dies, and he's now survived into modern times as basically kind of a mummy, like an original Imhotep Boris Karloff style mummy, a guy who's integrated with society to a degree, who really just wants to be reunited with his lover. But instead of trying to resurrect, he actually manages to find the antidote to his elixir, and that's in the ring of Thoth. So the Ring of Thoth is a device that actually ends his eternal life so he can be reunited with his lover.
This is interesting. So what time period is this?
So this was written by Arthur Conan Doyle in about 1890.
Because there's the ancient Greek myth of Tithonus, and I'm going to get this totally wrong, but a man fell in love with a goddess, I want to say Aurora, and she granted him eternal life so that they could be together, but he grew old and she fell out of love with him. But then he's kind of essentially cursed to walk the earth alone as an old man.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting. But you can see where the premise for the something of Thoth becomes a thing. And then there are a few other stories. You've got another story from Conan Doyle, his second mummy story, which is called Lot Number 249, in which basically an ancient a mummy is purchased at an auction, and through kind of a combination of a ritual and an ancient papyrus, the mummy is brought back to quote unquote life or unlife and is sent out on missions of vengeance. Now, what we're seeing here is the template for the 1950s mummy movie. Which is the first one where you see the mummy used as an instrument of revenge. Yeah. So vengeance, you know, is this theme that you see running through all of the mummy movies, including this latest one.
What's the driving theme of this one?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, literature, sex, and death. It all ties in. She is quite a sexual character, just in her dress and movements and things like that.
I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because first of all, first female mummy.
Caveat: I thought she was good. I thought
she was great.
I thought, the performance, bringing humanity to a monstrous figure is not a bad thing. That's Frankenstein all over, you know. Again, unfortunately muddled a little bit.
Yeah.
Because, you know, you mentioned this kind of secret organization. Mm-hmm. Are they good or bad? Like, they're good, really. They're just good in a
bad way.
Dick way. Yeah.
So going back to her, though, because you mentioned that you've got two things in there that I kind of want to pull out a bit. The sexualization, that's something that was critiqued kind of quite damningly in some reviews, that this is our first female mummy and she's a sex object. I don't think it's something that will necessarily age very well in that sense, but at the same time, I think it's quite timeless.
I think there is a problem with the sexualization in the sense that there's no overt need for it. So I think it's a fair point, you know, first grand female mummy character. Why does she have to be sexualized?
Well,
there's no reason why she can't be strong
without
and
that.
sex.
I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree.
You know,
but it feeds into the idea of the Oriental seductress. It feeds into this pulp notion of the odalisque, of the the Cleopatra being a seductress. Those are templates that were set in Western civilization.
But then there's nothing. But it's not a plot about love. It's not. Yeah. It's not like the other ones where she's trying to. There's no inference that she was in love with Set. So she wants to bring him back, which is what the other movies are about. So then you could tie the sexualization into that. She's trying to seduce Tom Cruise because, I mean, maybe that is it. Well, I mean, she is trying to seduce Tom Cruise to become Set. So I guess that's your sexualization, but there's no love to it. There's no...
Absolutely. It's an interesting thing.
You can't have sex without love. So that's...
Clearly. And I think that's something that Sofia Boutella brought to the role really well. And I think her performance, irrespective of her appearance, was actually very strong, probably the strongest in the movie by a fairly long shot. And it's unfortunate in a way that it does rest on these kind of over-sexualized, orientalized tropes that, she's a mummy, so she must be evil and sexy and evil, but we only want to know about it if she's sexy kind of way. It's like, does a male mummy need to be sexy? I suppose there are arguments for Imhotep being sexy.
He's shirtless a lot.
He's shirtless an awful lot, and he's pretty buff, I guess, for a decomposed guy.
It would have been... It's more interesting to see her not portrayed that way. Yeah. I think. To have her be more monstrous would have been more interesting to see what she could do with that. But then, this is where a lot of movies fall down of originality versus what will sell.
I suppose there is that. I suppose there's also a counter argument to that, which is to say that we shouldn't be selling the idea that, beautiful is always good and ugly is always evil, or vice versa. You know what I mean? Like it's maybe,
definitely.
Maybe it's a fair thing to say, like your original point, that you can be both in either direction. And if you're going to cast Sofia Boutella, you are getting, a unquestionably attractive actor in that role. We should discuss her appearance with respect to the inaccuracies of the Egyptian hieroglyphs next time, though.
Hieroglyphics.
It's a hieroglyphic script. But it's not. It's not. They're not hieroglyphs or hieroglyphics. I don't know what they are, but we'll get back to that. Now, on that bombshell, do you want to wrap this one up?
Sure. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for being on the show.
I hope you can unpack something out of that.
That's sadly all we have time for today, but be sure to check back in for new episodes which continue to explore manifestations of the ancient world in the modern, including interviews with a bevy of archaeologists and Egyptologists, Hermetics and Reconstructionists, and key players in historical entertainment, including authors, filmmakers, actors, and game designers. If you like the show, please subscribe and rate it on your preferred platform and tell all your friends. I've been Dr. Harrison, and this was the Profane Egyptologist podcast. Thanks for listening.